Scarbs, so let's move on to Ferrari.
Mm-hmm.
And they started the year brilliantly, didn't they? And it kind of all fell apart from Spa onwards, as you've said. But let's go into that in more detail. And prior to Spa, what were they looking to solve? They'd had their fair share of engine issues by then, obviously, hadn't they? And that was an issue for them. Reliability plus, I mean, that turbo that went in Spain must have just killed them, because he was leading by 12 seconds, I think, wasn't he?
Yeah.
The race was won.
Yep.
Despite it being an incredibly competitive qualifying, as you said. And that moment, I think, was the pivotal moment for Ferrari. It just very difficult to recover from something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think Ferrari, if we look at their year, they won the Winter Championship, as they so often do. And we're always like, oh, are they really good? And we got to those first races, and Red Bull were having problems. But clearly, everybody else was having even worse problems. Ferrari looked like they had it sussed. They had this stunning-looking car, qualified really strongly, held off Verstappen in the races until reliability for someone or another got in the way. Things were looking great, weren't they? And we suddenly thought, well, this is Ferrari's year, kind of at long last, it's good to see them back competitive. I think that was a little bit flattering at that point. Red Bull were overweight, they were struggling with the tyres a little bit, and the car was quite difficult to drive in those early stages, and had their reliability issues. So we never really saw in those first races with the fuel issues. Ferrari developed a car quite the opposite to Mercedes in lots of respect. They developed what was supposed to be a very low drag car with these big side pods that managed the airflow along the back of the car, and it's the ridge on the side pods, not the dip, that was the really important thing.
You were really impressed with the packaging when you first saw that car.
Yeah, no, it was they'd got such a different package, but internally the car was very conventional, which always gives you lots of reassurance that they haven't kind of gone too far with a concept to make it work. As obviously Mercedes had to really change the shape of their car to get their package to work. But the problem was it just wasn't having enough downforce. They were able to get these tyres to work in qualifying. Quite how with the downforce that they probably had was hard to fathom. But it really showed in the race that their tyre degradation was so much worse. And the more they tried to put wing on the car to get the downforce, the slower they became. And that drag, which they were trying to cut out from the car, naturally was overcome by, it's almost the same situation as a Mercedes, but in a slightly different direction. So I actually think Ferrari flattered to see very early in the season. I don't think that car was ever quite as good as we thought it was. And by the time that Red Bull had got their car worked out, really it was only qualifying where that Ferrari really shone. And as the year went on, budgets and fightbacks really became the big issue, and they just couldn't recover their season. And at the end, they just kind of got over the line with the championships, didn't they? I mean, it was literally, the last few laps of the last race. It
was, and it was, I mean, I have to say, they finished, obviously, in Abu Dhabi, as you say, pretty well. I mean, if you looked at that race in isolation, you'd think, Ferrari are right there.
Exactly.
They're only 8 seconds behind Max Verstappen
if
on
they
the
were
same
doing
strategy.
that every race, we wouldn't be having the same level of conversation.
Yeah.
But I think...
But what you're saying is ultimately what beat them is that they didn't do a good enough job of getting their head around tyre management in the way that Mercedes did. They had problems at Mercedes, but they kind of solved most of them by just managing the car really well in the race, whereas Ferrari didn't do that.
No, I think it's something that Mercedes have learned over even sort of the pre-2014 years. They've really learned their tyre management. It's one of the greatest skills of the team and its drivers, particularly Lewis, who, we all know can really manage a set of tyres better than probably any other driver. Ferrari weren't able to do that. That wasn't their focus. And again, it kind of goes back to the questions earlier about Binotto, and it's like, how are the team organising themselves? They knew they didn't have the budget to develop the car in the latter part of the year, although that was their original plan. And then they had reliability problems, and that knocked engine power, which slows them even more on the straights. And,
I wonder why they had the reliability problems, and I wonder whether any of it, Ferrari being obviously European, whether they were affected more by the COVID supply chain issues than maybe some of the other manufacturers. I mean, Renault possibly would have been exposed to that as well, and they've had their fair share of reliability as well. I
mean, I think that's a factor for everybody. I don't know if it's anything specific to the turbo. What was interesting, as I said, Ferrari kept that close coupled turbo at the back of the engine, so in lots of respects they weren't massively re-engineering it. And as we understood, it was quite difficult to pick apart from the Italian press quite what they did do to their engine over the winter. it seemed to be a lot more in the combustion chamber, and the turbo really wasn't mentioned as much.
Well, remind us again what they could have done over the winter. What were they allowed to do over the winter?
Well, they could do anything they wanted. They could literally build a completely new power unit. Every element of it could be completely new, as long as it was homologated by March, and then the second one back in September.
That's not the case this winter.
That's
though.
not the case. They cannot do that again. All they can now do is reliability upgrades.
So we can say that the decisions they took last winter were pretty much spot on, bearing in mind where they were before.
And knowing that they could, I think it's very similar to the Renault situation, is that they were able to be maybe too aggressive with the design of the engine, accepting some unreliability, knowing that they can fix it, but it's then locked in that advantage until 2026, which is, fairly obvious kind of philosophy to take. But the turbo seemed to consistently be something of a weak point of the car through all of those failures. That one in Austria where it literally blew out the side of the car, and even as we came into the late part of the season, you could hear noises from the turbocharger and the MGUH that you couldn't hear on other cars, and it's just
whine.
It's a very strange noise.
Sounds like the old supercharged Mercedes and auto unions.
It always reminds me when you used to wire up your car
the Alpinestars, actually.
Your car radio to the wrong wire, and you get the engine noise coming through the speakers.
But Scarbs, one of the reasons I understood that they went to split turbos was for reliability, to get the heat away, to separate the heat and to improve cooling for the turbo. And wouldn't that be one of the reasons if they've still got the close coupled turbo on the right? Isn't that one of the reasons they're unreliable?
I think, that packaging
Heat, vibration, packaging.
I don't think it was the fundamental reason. I think it's probably the primary. I think the primary is just general packaging. I think that's one of the kind of the benefits that comes with all of that. And again, knowing that was on its way out. So all I can assume is that they've done something quite clever with the manufacturing of the turbo housings and the impellers inside, the lubrication, or
haven't, because they've been unreliable though.
Well, maybe they've done something so clever that it just needs a bit of time to iron out the problems. And increasingly 3D printing is an aspect of certainly the housing design, and maybe they were working in that direction to get that working, but I don't have any inside information on that in particular.
But you're plugged into Shell. Aren't they telling you exactly what they've been doing with their lubrication?
No, it's always just the highest of levels. They would never. I mean, most teams would never actually accept that there's a separate oil cooling system just for the turbocharger, which is the case for most of the teams. They'll have a dedicated turbo oil pump and cooler somewhere on the car. So lots of this stuff is still shrouded in mystery and sort of super secrecy. So we'll never find out, and you can't trust a lot of the press when people will come out and state what isn't going on within the engine.
So Ferrari would have been thinking, we've got to change this, got to change that for next year, got to work on this. Oops, Abu Dhabi, we're not that bad after all. Where are they at now in terms of their 23 car? What do you think they'll be working on?
I mean, Abu Dhabi really was just so against the run of form as it was.
Mercedes were not very good.
Yeah, it was.
Ferrari were very good.
They'd switched around somehow in that last race, and I can see no explanation for it. If anything, I would have expected it to have probably been a bigger gap than we'd have seen previously.
Because there was a moment, was there not, on I think Saturday morning, when Charles said, and we saw it, he had the most massive moment in the middle of turns 2 and 3, high speed change of direction, I think bottomed out, and he was doing one of these in 7th gear or whatever.
Yeah, the car looked terrible all the way.
So you'd have to say at that moment they didn't have their ride heights sorted, and yet that race
come qualifying in the race it all came good. I can't explain that. I wish I could. Hopefully it's something that Ferrari has suddenly figured out in the data and got right on the day, and that will be a magic bullet for next year. I think what Ferrari need to work on, clearly power unit, there's no doubt about that. We understand that they weren't too bad on weight, so I don't think that's the thing. I think what they need to do is create a lot more downforce from that car now. And I think that will mean that they'll need to do something quite different with their side pods. Now, it's not to say that they won't keep the lovely ridge and the bathtub with the big louvers, but how they work the undercut and the flow down towards the diffuser, that is really the area they're going to have to work at. And I keep saying it, but you look towards Red Bull to see what they're doing and see how you can get more air down to the back of the car and how you manage that floor edge. That's really their key deficit this year. I think everything else, they were quite good with the porpoising. They've got dual rate springs, as Red Bull have got, particularly on the rear of the car, because luckily we were able to see.
They got Rory Byrne in Thailand.
They got Rory Byrne doing his fishing in Thailand, haven't we?
So
and I didn't see Days at his scuba diving.
What's that porpoising?
Yes.
Mark my words.
So yeah, I mean, I think Ferrari have probably got a bigger catch-up job to do, and I think, you know, uncertainty over the technical management, over the strategic management, which again has been, you know, really has been. But I think these are the, you know, that in that respect, that's, you know, the perennial discussion you have about Ferrari, isn't it? It's the politics. It's allowing the right engineers to be doing the right things, and Ferrari forever seemed
putting Charles Leclerc on intermediates in his pit stop at Monaco. You know, it's all those stupid things.
Stuff
or
like
hard
that.
tyres in Hungary. Renzo Piano, beautiful wind tunnel from the outside. How state of the art is that on the inside, would you say? How does it compare with Sauber and Red Bull?
Certainly, I think what we've seen is that this year's car worked as well as Ferrari expected it to. They got porpoising under control quite quickly. So that suggests to me that they've got their aero correlation right, but what they haven't got right is the targets that they were setting themselves. They aimed for, you know, very low drag.
And you would imagine that their CFD guys are as good as anybody out there.
When I say
Italy,
wind tunnel and aero, I'm talking about.
Yeah, but I'm also talking the way they recruit and the engineers they get in Italy. You'd imagine would be pretty switched on guys.
I think they're quite slick
I would
in that
think they've got a
respect.
good team there. So it remains, I suppose, in terms of looking at Ferrari in 23, whether they've probably got a more accurate target of what to aim for. In other words, if that's what they achieve, they'll do well. The question is, will they achieve it, I guess? And
I'd say there's a bigger question of Ferrari achieving it than Mercedes achieving it over the winter, which is...
And that applies to the power units as well in terms of reliability.
Yeah, I mean, I think you know, a winter of, you know, reliability updates would hopefully solve their problems. I don't think they've got something fundamentally wrong with their power unit that it will never get better. You know, they get that solved, and, you know, I think they're as competitive as anyone.